But it has to do with a special girl in my life. Ooh, I know. No, it's not my wife. Oh, no. Now I've got people interested. So, back in 2010, I know probably some of you weren't even born yet. Back in 2010, well, actually started in 2009. I met this girl. I was a part of a worship team that was playing at a camp, and this girl was there, and some of my friends, she was a friend of some of my friends, and so they introduced me to her. And at first, I was just kind of like, oh yeah, just somebody new, like I didn't know, who she was or anything. But as the week went on, I got to know her a little bit better, and I started to realize, like, wow, like, this girl's pretty cool. And I got to hear her heart, her passion for Jesus, and come to find out, like, she wants to be a worship leader, and she's, like, an amazing singer. And I was like, man, like, I'm really interested in her now. And so we started talking, we started just kind of hanging out. And the problem is we lived a long ways apart. But we're like, you know what? If this is going to work out, let's just continue the conversation. Let's just see where this goes. Fast forward, 2010, I had the opportunity to move closer to where she lived. And so with talking with her, kind of seeing like we were both heading in the same direction, I made the choice, like, all right, I'm going to move to her state to be a little bit closer. And we started our relationship. And it was one of those relationships that, you always see the movies about how, like, everything just works out perfectly. And I was just, like, so in love with this girl. And so we started talking eventually about, do we see this as being something that would lead to marriage? And, she was like, absolutely, I think this is exactly where this is leading. And so I began, saving up for the engagement ring, making plans for our future, and everything seemed perfect until one day I get a phone call. And she's like, Jordan, we need to talk. Like, that's never a good way to start a conversation. And so she meets me at my work, and she just says, we're done. No explanation, no reason. She didn't know this, but I had already bought the engagement ring. And she's just like, we are done. I don't want to talk. This is the end. Not like one of those things where it's like we break up but we still talk and hang out and do everything. She's just like, no, this is it. And I was just like completely blindsided. Well, come to find out, through a friend of mine, she was actually seeing somebody behind my back the entire time. And to make it worse, it was a friend of mine. And in that moment, never in my life have I been so hurt, felt so betrayed, and had such a bitterness inside me. Where I remember just thinking, I hope that something happens to you, that you would feel the same way of what you're putting me through. To the point where I couldn't even hear their names without physically feeling sick. Because there was so much bitterness, resentment, and if I'm going to be 100% honest with you, hatred towards them. And it was in that moment that I had to really wrestle with, what does forgiveness look like? Because we understand the concept of forgiveness, but it's another thing to actually have to put it into practice in real life situations. And today we're going to be looking at a story that Jesus gives in the New Testament. And one of the things I love about Jesus is he's a good storyteller. He tells stories that help relate spiritual ideas and practices in a way that's relatable. And so he shares this story in Matthew chapter 18 that talks at the heart of this idea of forgiveness. And to kind of set up this story, we have to understand kind of the setting. Now, before Jesus goes in the story, one of the apostles, Peter, asked Jesus a question. Jesus was talking about issues within the church, and Peter says, Jesus, how many times should we forgive somebody? And he says, should we forgive them 7 times? But Jesus responds with, oh, you say 7 times, but I actually say 70 times 7. And essentially what Jesus was saying is, just stop counting. There's not a number that is a special number that once you reach it, oh, okay, we can stop forgiving. And then Jesus shares this story. And if you have your Bibles or you're taking notes, it's in Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 through 35. Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 through 35. Listen to what this says. Jesus is speaking. He says, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I love to do, and maybe I'm just a nerd like this, but I like to go into the original languages that the Bible was written in, because a lot of times when we find out their original words and what they actually meant, stories become way more alive. And so right away, I was just curious, 10,000 bags of gold. What is that? What did that mean in that time? And so in the Greek, it's actually this term that is called, and maybe some of your translations have it already written in there, but it was actually 10,000 talents. Now, it's not like talents like an ability, but it was a measure of money. And 1 talent equaled about 6,000 denarii, and a denarii was essentially an entire day's wage. So to break it down in a modern day kind of mind frame here, let's just say somebody makes, let's say, $50,000 a year. And when you take that number and you divide it by working days, and we're just going to be generous and give them the weekends off. We'll give them Fridays or Saturdays and Sundays off. So essentially they're working 260 days a year. You divide that into 50,000 and they make roughly $192.30 a day. You multiply that by 6,000 and you get $1,153,846. That's 1 talent. It says 10,000 talents. So you multiply that and you get $1.5 billion. So this servant owed the king $11.5 billion. Now put yourself in that shoe, in that person's shoes. I don't know about you, I don't know what jobs you have, but that's a lot of money. I don't even think I've made $1 million in my lifetime. And here somebody is in debt over $11.5 billion. This is a huge amount of money. So it says that he owed him this enormous amount of money. And verse 25, it says, since he was not able to pay, obviously, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. But notice verse 27. The servant's master, took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Again, put yourselves in that person's shoes. You are in debt $11.5 billion. And the person's like, nah, forget about it. You're good. Go on. Whoa! Like, that's huge. But verse 28, but when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. And in that, it ends up being about $13,000. I mean, that's a lot, but that's something that you could pay off in a couple years, if not earlier, depending on how much you made. So it owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But the first servant refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay back the debt. When the other people saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in, says, you wicked servant, I canceled all of your debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servants just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. When we see this story, we see a radical contrast of what forgiveness looks like. Where we have one person that essentially he has, when we do the numbers, again, 6,000 days' wages is one denarii, is one talent. Essentially, if he was to work 60 million days, he still wouldn't be able to pay it off. Essentially, that's over 20 lifetimes. And I find it interesting, he begs for more time. Like, give me a few more lifetimes to pay this off. But the master had pity on him. And he chose to forgive him. He didn't say, okay, I'll give you more time. He didn't say, okay, I'll give you more time, but I'll add another percentage. No, he said, your debt is completely forgiven. You and I are good. You can leave. There's nothing to worry about. Now again, if the story were to end there, we'd be like, oh man, that's an awesome story. But it continues on where somebody who owed him such a small amount compared to what he had been forgiven. But he is now willing to show the same grace and forgiveness to a fellow servant. And so the master, in his anger towards the first servant, has him thrown in prison and tortured because his lack of grace and forgiveness. And one of the things that I see is it's hard for us to really do forgiveness well in our culture. Everything in our culture points to you need to get what's yours. You need to get revenge. And it's so easy for people to kind of create their own groups that are just going to tell them the things that they want to hear. And we begin to realize it's so much easier to remember what people owe us than for us to be remembered of what we've been saved from by God. And I think the reason why it's difficult is because when you look at the story, the man who didn't forgive the other servant, in the eyes of the culture then, he wasn't doing anything wrong. Somebody owed him money, and so he had every right within the culture to demand repayment. And so in the eyes of culture, he was okay. Yes, people owe you money. Yes, you should get that back. And I think a lot of times in our culture, when it comes to forgiveness, it's really easy to listen to our culture that says, no, you should be mad at that person for what they did. You should treat them poorly because people would understand. No, yeah, you should get revenge and let them go through the very same things that they put you through. And all of a sudden, we begin to see that, again, putting this idea of forgiveness is so much harder in practice than just simply this idea. Because forgiveness has little to do with what's fair. It has little to do with what's right in the eyes of the world, but instead it has everything to do with our hearts. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32, it says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Forgiveness doesn't mean that that person pays you back. Forgiveness doesn't mean that they try and fix the situation to undo the damages. And something within us says that's not fair. And that's true. You're right. Forgiveness is not fair. Grace is not fair. But that's actually the turning point. This is actually the aha moment. Because this story is not about money. The story that Jesus is saying is not about what is right in the eyes of culture. This story is about grace. Because forgiveness is not fair. Grace is not fair. Grace means that God He gives us what we don't deserve. So forgiveness is not pretending that the hurt didn't happen, or that it was right for them to do that. But it's choosing within our hearts not to make them pay for it. And I know some of you are probably thinking, yeah, that's great, but you don't know what this person did to me. And you're right, I don't know your story. But I also want to point out that forgiveness does not mean that you ignore healthy boundaries in your life. Forgiveness does not mean that you just pretend that all trust is restored with maybe somebody who has broken your trust. Forgiveness does not mean that you stay in dangerous or harmful situations. Essentially, forgiveness is about your heart, not their access to you. So this first servant, he didn't lose his freedom because he owed money. He lost his freedom because he refused to let forgiveness change his heart and to pass on that same forgiveness. And here's what is so great about the gospel of the good news of who Jesus is when Jesus is telling the story, Jesus knew where he was headed. When Jesus was sharing the story, he knew he was on his way to the cross. He knew the pain, the suffering, the death that he was going to endure to show each and every one of us grace and forgiveness. So Jesus isn't just simply just sharing this story and not dealing with that himself. He knows what it is to show deep, tremendous grace and forgiveness. Not just to one person, but the entire world, from beginning till the end of time. Not because we fixed ourselves, not because we said we're sorry perfectly, not because anything that we could do to repay, but simply because he loved us and showed us grace. Because forgiveness cannot be earned. There's no loan extension that we could ever pay it back. And just like in the story Jesus gave, the king didn't say, okay, pay me back when you can. The king didn't reward the servant for good behavior. There was nothing the servant could do to repay back the full amount. But the master said, it doesn't matter, I forgive you. It's a gift, completely undeserved, freely given, no strings attached. God showed us grace. In Ephesians 2:8, it says, God saved you by his grace when you believe. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. This idea of a gift. It'd be like maybe one of your best friends on your birthday or Christmas giving you a gift. And you open up the gift and it was what you had wanted forever. It is something that you have been asking for and you're like, awesome. But then you notice at the end of the box, there's a little note that says, this is how much this gift cost. Here's my Venmo. You can pay me back in the next year. You'd be like, what kind of gift is that? A gift is not something we pay for, not something we earn. It's something that is freely given. And that is the gift that Jesus gives us. Not something that we earn, not trying harder to do better, to be more righteous. It is a gift that we do not deserve, that he gives freely, because he is so loving and full of grace. And so Jesus understands that forgiveness does not mean that what the other person said or did was right, that it didn't hurt, that there aren't things that happen because of it, but it's changing how in our hearts we think and treat those people. Forgiveness is letting go of revenge, releasing the debt, choosing freedom over bitterness. And so for us, when we realize how much we have been forgiven, we can give that same forgiveness. And in closing, I want to share this. Jesus didn't forgive us because it was easy. He forgave us because he loved. John 1:14 tells us that he is full of grace and truth. And later in that passage it says, because of him we have received grace upon grace upon grace. In the story I started out with, I struggled to forgive both my girlfriend and my friend. It was something I wrestled with. And I knew that God had wanted me to forgive them. But it was more of just kind of like, oh, in my okay, yeah, I forgive them, but in my heart, I still harbored this bitterness. And I remember God calling me out, saying, you need to truly forgive them. And I remember being, well, what does that look like? And God says, I want you to pray for them. Oh, I can pray for them. God, I pray that you would bring them through all these things so they can see what they've done. And God's like, no, wrong prayer, wrong prayer. I want you to pray blessings on them. wait, what? They wronged me. They are the ones who betrayed and hurt me.